The Great Library of Thesara Prime was the oldest building in the known galaxy. It sat at the center of the capital world, like a mountain made of glass and light. Its halls stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, filled with data caches and memory crystals from civilizations that had risen and fallen long before anyone alive could remember. 12 species shared this world and shared this library, and together they called themselves the Concord of 12. They believed they knew everything worth knowing. They believed they had mapped every star, cataloged every species, and understood every corner of the galaxy they called home. They were wrong. Setha did not know this yet. She was young, even by the standards of her own people, the Velari. The Velari were tall and thin, one with skin like pale silver and eyes that shifted color with their emotions. They were known across the Concord as scholars and record keepers, a species that valued knowledge the way the Dralith valued war or the Korvathi valued trade. Setha had earned her place in the Great Library only 6 months ago, and she still felt small every time she walked through its doors. Her job was simple. She worked in the deep archives, the oldest and most neglected section of the library. Nobody important came down here. The data caches were ancient, many of them corrupted or written in languages that had not been spoken for 10,000 years. Her task was to catalog them, tag them, and move on. It was boring work. Most of the caches held nothing useful. Old trade records, star charts of systems that had long since been mapped 100 times over, diplomatic correspondence between species that no longer existed. But on this particular morning, in the dim blue light of Archive Level 97, Setha found something different. The data cache was small, no bigger than her fist. It was buried inside a sealed container made of a metal she did not recognize. The container itself was hidden behind a false wall panel that had come loose after what she guessed was centuries of slow decay. She almost missed it entirely. She had been reaching for a different cache on the shelf above when her elbow knocked the panel free, and the container fell to the floor with a heavy thud. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. There were no markings on the outside, no species insignia, no date stamp, nothing to tell her what it was or where it came from. She tried to open it with the standard tools, but the metal resisted everything she used. Finally, she brought it to the analysis station at the end of the corridor and ran a deep scan. The results made her stop breathing for a moment. The container was over 40,000 years old. That was older than the Concord itself, older than the Great Library, older than the Dralith Empire, which liked to claim it was the most ancient civilization in the galaxy. Whatever was inside this container had been placed here before any of the current galactic powers had even learned to fly. Setha spent the next 3 hours carefully extracting the data cache from the container. When she finally managed to interface it with the library's systems, the information that poured out was fragmented and incomplete. Large sections were corrupted beyond recovery, but what remained was enough to make her forget about lunch, forget about her evening plans, and forget about everything else she was supposed to be doing. The cache contained files about a species. They were called Terrans. She had never heard the name before. She searched the library's main database and found nothing. She searched the Concord's official species registry. All 12 member species, all 416 recognized minor species, all 9,000 cataloged extinct species, and found no match. The word Terran did not exist in any active record anywhere in the known galaxy, but in this ancient cache, they were described in detail that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The Terrans came from a world called Earth. It orbited an unremarkable yellow star on the far outer edge of the galaxy's western spiral arm, a region so remote that even modern star charts labeled it as empty. Earth was classified in the old files as a Category 12 death world, and Setha had to read that designation 3 times before she believed it. The Concord's planetary classification system ran from Category 1 to Category 10. Category 1 meant a paradise world, stable climate, gentle weather, abundant resources, no significant predators. Most Concord homeworlds fell between Category 2 and Category 5. Category 6 and above were considered dangerous. Category 8 worlds were considered uninhabitable. Nobody had ever used Category 10. This file used Category 12. The planet's axial tilt created extreme seasonal variations across its surface. Its tectonic plates were active, generating earthquakes and volcanic eruptions with terrifying frequency. Its weather systems produced hurricanes, tornadoes, Floods, droughts, blizzards, and heat waves, sometimes all in the same region within a single orbital cycle. Its oceans covered 70% of its surface and were filled with predators. Its land masses were filled with predators. Its microscopic biosphere was filled with organisms that invaded other organisms and consumed them from the inside. And somehow, impossibly, a sentient species had evolved there. The Terrans were described as bipedal, endothermic, omnivorous mammals. They were not particularly large. They were not particularly fast. They had no natural armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning, no ability to regenerate limbs or survive in vacuum or see in complete darkness. By every standard metric the Concorde used to evaluate a species' survival potential, the Terrans should have gone extinct before they ever developed language. But they did not go extinct. They thrived. The ancient files described a species that had adapted to almost every environment their hostile world could throw at them. They lived in frozen wastelands and burning deserts. They lived on mountains and in valleys, in forests and on open plains, on islands and along coastlines battered by storms. They ate almost anything. They survived injuries that would kill most Concorde species outright. Their bones healed. Their skin healed. Their bodies fought off infections with an immune system that was, according to the old records, terrifyingly aggressive. And then there was the matter of their minds. The Terrans were, the files suggested, pathologically persistent. They did not stop. They did not give up. When faced with a problem they could not solve, they did not accept it and move on. They became obsessed. They worked at it and worked at it and worked at it until they broke through or died trying. They formed social bonds of extraordinary intensity. They were capable of cooperation on a scale that the ancient authors of these files clearly found disturbing. They could set aside personal survival instincts to protect others. They would charge into danger to save strangers. They would sacrifice themselves for ideas, for principles, for people they had never met. And the files called them persistence predators. They had hunted the megafauna of their world not through strength or speed, but through endurance. They simply followed their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They could walk and run for distances that no other known species could match. They sweated to regulate their body temperature, which meant they could keep moving in heat that would shut down any other predator on their world. Sayatha read all of this with growing disbelief. It sounded like fiction. It sounded like someone had designed the perfect death world organism in a laboratory and then written a fantasy about what it might do if it developed spaceflight. But the files were not fiction. They were clinical. They were scientific. They had the dry, careful tone of researchers who were documenting something real. It's something they had observed, something that frightened them. The last section of the readable data was the most troubling. It described the Terrans' first contact with the wider galaxy. According to the files, the Terrans had developed faster-than-light travel approximately 50,000 years ago, roughly 10,000 years before the Concorde was founded. They had ventured out from their death world and found a galaxy already populated by older, more established civilizations. These civilizations had not welcomed them. The details were sparse, corrupted by time, but the implication was clear. The Terrans had been rejected, pushed out, treated as primitives from a worthless world in a worthless corner of space, and then they had vanished. The files offered no explanation for where they went, and the last entry simply noted that all Terran activity in known space had ceased, and that their homeworld's coordinates had been purged from official records. Someone long ago had wanted the Terrans forgotten. It was late in the evening when Saytha finally pulled herself away from the data. Her eyes ached. Her hands were trembling. She gathered her notes and took them upstairs to the office of her mentor, High Curator Dorovan. Dorovan was old even by Valari standards. His silver skin had faded to a dull gray, and his eyes had settled into a permanent shade of deep blue that meant he was perpetually tired. He had spent over 200 years in the Great Library, and there was very little that could surprise him anymore. He listened to Sayatha's breathless summary with the patience of someone who had heard 1,000 breathless summaries before. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his long fingers together. "The Terrans," he said. His voice was calm and dry. "You found a reference to the Terrans." Saytha blinked. "You know about them. Every species has its ghost stories, child. The Korvathi tell tales of the empty ships, vessels found drifting with no crew and no explanation. The Dralith have their legends of the Shadow Fleet that appeared during the Crimson War and turned the tide before vanishing. The Thessari speak of the Builders, an ancient race that supposedly seeded the galaxy with life before disappearing. He waved a hand dismissively. The Terrans are our version, a Deathworld species of impossible resilience that once walked among the stars and then vanished without a trace. It is a myth, Setha, a story elders tell to frighten younglings into behaving. But the data cache is real, she insisted. It is over 40,000 years old. The analysis confirmed it. This is not a story someone made up. These are scientific records. Old records from an unknown source, heavily corrupted, describing a species that no one has ever encountered and that does not appear in any verified database in the galaxy. Dorovin's eyes shifted to a gentle orange, the color of affection. He was not mocking her. He was trying to be kind. You are a good archivist, Saitha. Your instincts are sharp, but do not let one mysterious find pull you down a path that leads nowhere. Catalog the cache, file it properly, pour, and move on to your next assignment. Saitha wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that the detail in those files was too specific to be fiction, that the scientific language was too precise, that the fear between the lines was too real. But she could see in his eyes that his mind was made up, and she had not yet earned enough standing to challenge a high curator. She nodded, took her notes, and left his office. But she did not move on. Over the following weeks, Saitha spent every free hour she had in the deep archives. She searched neighboring sections, pulled out caches from the same era, cross-referenced languages and dating methods. She found fragments, tiny, scattered pieces of information that mentioned the Terrans indirectly. A trade record that referenced goods from an unregistered Deathworld origin. A diplomatic memo that warned against engaging with persistence-class species. A single line in what appeared to be a military report. Terran adaptability exceeds all current models. Recommend avoidance. Each fragment was small. Each one by itself meant nothing, but together they formed a pattern, and the pattern told Saitha that the Terrans were not a myth. They were a secret. Someone a very long time ago had gone to great effort to erase them from the galaxy's memory. The question was why. While Saitha searched for answers in the past, something was happening in the present that no one was paying attention to. Along the outer veil, the vast, one empty region of space that separated the known galaxy from the unexplored far side. A network of deep space sensor arrays quietly did their work. These arrays had been in place for thousands of years. They monitored the veil for any sign of activity, though no one seriously expected to find any. The veil was dead space. No stars, no planets, no resources, no reason for anyone to go there. It existed on star charts as a gray wall of nothing, and that was how everyone thought of it. But over the past several months, the arrays had been detecting anomalies. The readings were subtle at first, tiny gravitational fluctuations, barely above the noise floor of the sensors. A junior technician at the Concord's monitoring station 12 noticed them and flagged them for review. His supervisor glanced at the data, shrugged, and marked it as stellar migration drift, the natural movement of distant stars and dark matter that occasionally produced faint gravitational ripples. The technician was not satisfied with this explanation. The fluctuations were too regular, too evenly spaced. They looked less like natural drift and more like something moving in formation. He wrote a detailed report and submitted it through proper channels. The report traveled up the chain of command until it reached the Shield Wardens, the Concord's military arm. A mid-ranking officer read it, noted that the anomalies were located in the outer veil, where nothing of interest existed, and filed it in the low-priority queue. It would be reviewed eventually, maybe in a few months, maybe in a year. There were more pressing concerns: border disputes between the Dralith and the Korvathi, a piracy in the Thessari trade lanes, the usual business of keeping 12 species from fighting each other. The report sat in the queue, unread. The anomalies continued, and they were getting stronger. Back in the Great Library, Saitha made one final discovery. It was late at night, long after the other archivists had gone home. She was working on the last fragment from the original data cache, a section so corrupted that the translation algorithms had given it only a 12% chance of producing readable text. She ran the algorithms anyway. She ran them over and over, tweaking parameters, trying different linguistic models, feeding in every scrap of context she had gathered from her weeks of research. On the 43rd attempt, the algorithms produced a single coherent passage. It was short, only 2 sentences. But when Scytha read them, she felt the blood drain from her face and her hands go cold. The passage read, "Do not mistake their silence for absence. They are not lost, they are waiting." She sat alone in the blue light of the deep archives and stared at those words for a very long time. Far away beyond the outer veil, in the vast and uncharted reaches of the galaxy's far side, something enormous moved through the darkness between stars. It moved with purpose. It moved with patience. It moved in a formation so precise and so large that it bent the fabric of space around it, sending gravitational ripples across millions of light years. It had been waiting for a very, very long time, and now it was coming home. The sensor arrays along the outer veil recorded another set of anomalies, stronger this time, much stronger. The readings scrolled across the screens at Monitoring Station 12, and the junior technician, who had first noticed them months ago, stared at his display with wide eyes. He reached for his communication console to file another report. Then he stopped. Reports went nowhere. Reports sat in queues. Reports were ignored by people who were too busy or too comfortable to care about strange readings from the edge of nowhere. Instead, he copied the data to a private storage device, tucked it into his jacket, and left the station. He did not know who to tell. He did not know who would listen. But he knew, with a certainty that sat like a cold stone in his stomach, that something was coming, and the galaxy was not ready. On Thesara Prime, Scytha locked the translated passage in her personal safe and tried to sleep. She could not. She lay in her small apartment near the library and stared at the ceiling and thought about a species that had been erased from history, a species born on a world that should have killed them, a species that had been cast out of the galaxy and had responded not with war, not with revenge, but with silence. A silence that had lasted 50,000 years. She thought about Dorvan's words. Every species has its ghost stories, and maybe he was right. Maybe the Terrans were just another legend, another fairy tale, another comforting myth that gave the galaxy's children something to whisper about in the dark. But myths did not leave data caches buried behind false walls. Myths did not generate gravitational anomalies along the outer veil. Myths did not write warnings to the future in languages that predated civilization. Something was out there, something real, something patient, and it was no longer waiting. 3 months passed after Scytha's discovery, and the galaxy continued to turn as it always had. The Concord of 12 held its meetings and passed its resolutions. The Draelith rattled their weapons at anyone who looked at them wrong. The Korvati ran their trade routes and counted their profits. The Valari kept their records and tended their libraries. Everything was normal. Everything was as it had been for thousands of years, except it was not. The first reports came from the frontier systems of the Outer Reach, the scattered colonies and mining operations that clung to the galaxy's edge like barnacles on the hull of an old ship. These were rough places, far from the comfort and safety of the core worlds. When the species that lived out here were tough, independent, and not easily frightened. They dealt with equipment failures, supply shortages, pirate raids, and the occasional solar storm as a matter of daily life. They did not scare easily. But something was happening out here that no one could explain. It started with the navigation systems. A Thesari cargo hauler making a routine run between 2 mining colonies found its navigation computer adjusting course without any input from the crew. The adjustment was small, a 2-degree shift that added barely an hour to their travel time. The captain, a cautious woman named Vreen, was annoyed but not alarmed. She assumed it was a software error and made a note to have the system checked at the next port. 2 days later, she found out that the 2-degree shift had taken her ship around the edge of a radiation pocket that her sensors had not detected. If she had flown through it on the original course, the radiation would have killed her entire crew within minutes. She filed a report. It was one of dozens. Across the Outer Reach, ships were experiencing the same thing. Navigation systems making tiny unexplained adjustments. Course corrections that seemed random until you looked at what they were avoiding. Asteroid clusters, radiation fields, unstable gravity wells, debris from ancient collisions that no chart had ever mapped. Every correction saved lives. Every correction came from nowhere. The ship's computers showed no sign of external interference. No hacking, no remote access, no signal of any kind. The adjustments simply appeared, as if the navigation systems had suddenly become smarter than they were supposed to be. Then the rescue started. A Corvathi mining vessel lost power near a collapsing star. Its engines failed, its emergency systems failed, and its crew of 47 sent out a distress beacon and prepared to die. The nearest Concorde rescue ship was 8 hours away. Far too long. The collapsing star's gravity would pull them in within 2. But 40 minutes after the distress beacon went out, the mining vessel lurched. Something had locked onto them with a tractor beam of enormous power and was pulling them away from the star. The crew rushed to their viewports and saw nothing. Their sensors showed nothing. But the pull was real, and it was strong, and within 20 minutes they were clear of the danger zone. Though when the Concorde rescue ship finally arrived, they found the mining vessel drifting safely in open space. Its crew was alive, bewildered, and unable to explain what had saved them. There was no trace of another ship anywhere in the sector. Similar incidents multiplied. A Valari research station caught in the path of an unexpected meteor shower found the meteors deflected by an invisible force. A Thesari passenger liner with a failing life support system discovered the problem had been repaired from the outside while the ship was in transit. A small colony on a frontier moon was warned of an incoming seismic event by a transmission on a frequency no one in the Concorde used. The transmission came in a language no one recognized. It simply said, in badly translated galactic common, "Move to high ground. Mosh, you have 4 hours." They moved. 4 hours later, the valley where the colony had been built was buried under a landslide. Nobody knew what was happening. The frontier communities whispered among themselves. Some said it was the builders, the mythical ancient race that the Thesari legend spoke of. Others said it was some kind of automated defense system left over from a forgotten civilization. Others said nothing at all because they had no explanation and did not want to admit it. And then there was the matter of the pirates. The outer reach had always been plagued by piracy. The Concorde's military, the shield wardens, did not have enough ships to patrol such a vast region, and the pirates took advantage of this. They raided cargo ships, extorted colonies, and generally made life miserable for anyone trying to make an honest living on the frontier. But over the past 2 months, pirate activity in the outer reach had dropped to almost zero. The reason became clear when a Concorde patrol ship stumbled across the remains of a pirate fleet in an otherwise empty sector. 6 ships, fast, well-armed raiders that had terrorized the region for years, were drifting in a loose cluster. Their engines were dead. Their weapon systems had been fused shut. The barrels melted and sealed as if they had been exposed to temperatures that should not exist in the vacuum of space. Their communication systems were destroyed, but their life support was untouched. Their crews were alive. Every single one of them was unconscious, lying peacefully in their bunks as if they had simply fallen asleep at the same moment. Medical scans showed no injuries, no drugs in their systems, no explanation for their condition. They woke up hours later with splitting headaches and no memory of what had happened. The pirate captain, a scarred Draelith named Torek, was interrogated by the shield wardens. He could remember nothing useful. His fleet had been preparing to raid a Corvathi supply convoy. They had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the ambush point, and then nothing. A flash of light, a sound he could not describe, and then he woke up in a shield warden brig with his ships gutted and his weapons turned to slag. The shield wardens were troubled but had no leads. They filed the incident as unknown hostile engagement and moved on. It was a Corvathi freighter captain named Roll who finally brought the mystery into focus. Roll was old and hard and had been flying freight across the outer reach for over 30 years. He had survived pirate attacks, engine failures, cargo disputes, and a bar fight on Thesara Prime that had left him with a metal plate in his skull and a permanent distrust of anyone who smiled too much. He was not a man who believed in ghosts or legends or things that went bump in the void. His ship, the Broken Promise, was a battered old hauler that should have been scrapped a decade ago. Roll kept it flying through stubbornness and an encyclopedic knowledge of its quirks. He knew every rattle, every groan, every flickering light on that ship. He could diagnose an engine problem by the sound it made from 3 decks away. So when the Broken Promise's main engine failed catastrophically while passing within dangerous proximity of a red dwarf star, Roll knew immediately that he was going to die. The engine had not just failed, it had shattered. The containment field had collapsed, the fuel lines had ruptured, and the backup systems had been fried by the cascade. There was no fixing it. Not out here. Not in the time they had. The red dwarf's gravity was already pulling them in. Rule's navigator, a young Thesari named Pell, calculated that they had approximately 90 minutes before the heat and radiation killed them. Less if the ship's hull integrity failed first. Rule sent out a distress beacon. He knew it was pointless. The nearest station was hours away. But you sent the beacon anyway because that was what you did. You did everything you could. Not even when everything you could do was not enough. Then he gathered his crew of 12 in the common room and told them the truth. They were going to die. He was sorry. He wished he had gotten the engine overhauled at Corvath Station, like he had been meaning to do for the past 6 months. He wished a lot of things. His crew took it with the grim acceptance of people who had always known that space was trying to kill them. Pell cried quietly. The cargo handlers played cards. Roll went back to the bridge and sat in his captain's chair and watched the red dwarf grow larger in the viewport. 40 minutes passed, and then the broken promise stopped falling. Roll felt it before the sensors registered it, a deep vibration that ran through the entire ship, a hum that resonated in his metal skull plate and made his teeth ache. The ship was being held. Something had caught them in a grip so powerful that it was overriding the gravity of a star. He looked at his sensor display. It showed nothing. Empty space in every direction. But that was impossible. Something was holding his ship. Something was pulling them backward, away from the red dwarf, slowly and steadily, and with a strength that made Rule's instruments scream with readings they were not designed to process. He opened a communication channel. All frequencies, maximum power. This is Captain Roll of the freighter Broken Promise. Whoever you are, whatever you are, I can see what you are doing, and I am grateful. Please identify yourself. Silence. The hum continued. The ship continued to move backward. Rule tried again, and again, and again. For 20 minutes he broadcast on every frequency he had, one in every language he knew, begging for a response. He was about to give up when his communication console lit up with an incoming signal. It was on a frequency so far outside the normal range that his equipment barely registered it. The signal was weak, or rather, it was carefully controlled. Just strong enough for him to receive, and not a fraction more. It was not a voice. It was an image. Rull stared at his screen as the image resolved. It was blurry, distorted by the unusual frequency, but he could make out the basic shape. It showed a figure, bipedal, roughly humanoid in form, but not matching any species Rull had ever seen. The figure was standing upright. One arm was raised, palm facing outward, fingers spread, an open hand. Rull did not know what the gesture meant. But something about it, something ancient and instinctive, and buried deep in a part of his brain that was older than language, told him it meant no harm. The image held for 10 seconds. Then it vanished. The communication channel went dead. 20 minutes later, the Broken Promise was deposited gently in open space, well clear of the red dwarf's gravity well. The hum faded, the vibration stopped, and whatever had saved them was gone. Rull sat in his captain's chair for a long time after that. His crew gathered around him, asking questions he could not answer. Pell asked if they should report the incident. Rull said yes, but he already knew that no one would believe them. He was wrong about that. One person believed him. Kitsitha had been monitoring frontier reports through an unofficial channel, a network of contacts she had built among archivists and data clerks across the outer reach. She had asked them to flag anything unusual, anything unexplained, anything that did not fit the normal patterns of life on the frontier. The reports had been flooding in for weeks. Navigation corrections, invisible rescues, disabled pirates. She had collected them all, organized them, cross-referenced them with the information from the ancient data cache. And now, with Rull's account in the image of the bipedal figure with the open hand, she had something she could not ignore. She went back to Dorovan. The High Curator listened to her this time with less patience and more concern. It's not because he believed her. She could see in his eyes that he still thought she was chasing shadows. But because the volume of reports troubled him. One strange incident was an anomaly. 2 was a coincidence. 47 was a pattern. Even if I accept that something unusual is happening in the outer reach, Donovan said slowly, that does not mean it is connected to your ancient data cache. There are 100 possible explanations. An unregistered species with cloaking technology, an automated defense network, a natural phenomenon we have not yet identified. All of those explanations require something to be out there, Setha said. Something real. Something with technology far beyond anything the Conquered possesses. That is the point. Donovan was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. You want to take this to the assembly? It was not a question. He could see it in her eyes. The color had shifted to bright gold, the Valari shade of absolute determination. Yes, she said. They will not listen. The Dralith will call you a fearmonger. The Korvathi will worry about trade disruptions. The Thesari will form a committee, and nothing will be done. Maybe, Setha said, but I have to try. Donovan studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Then at least let me help you prepare. If you are going to be humiliated in front of the entire Concord Assembly, you should be humiliated with proper documentation. It was, Setha realized, his way of saying he cared. She spent 2 weeks preparing her presentation. She organized the data from the ancient cache, the frontier reports, rules account, in her own analysis into a comprehensive document that she rehearsed until she could recite it in her sleep. She reached out to Rule, who agreed to provide a recorded testimony. She contacted the junior technician from Monitoring Station 12. His name was Kaol, and he was a nervous young Thesari who had been trying to get someone to listen to his sensor data for months. He sent her everything he had. The gravitational anomalies along the outer veil were no longer subtle. They were strong, consistent, and unmistakably artificial. Something was moving on the other side of the veil, something very large, and it was getting closer. Setha presented her case to the Concord Assembly on a cool morning in the Great Dome Chamber at the heart of Thesara Prime. The chamber was vast. It designed to hold representatives from all 12 member species. The seats rose in concentric rings around a central platform, and every ring was full. Word had spread that a young Valari archivist was going to make an extraordinary claim, and curiosity, if nothing else, had drawn a crowd. She spoke clearly and carefully. She presented the data cache evidence. She showed the frontier reports. She played Rule's testimony. She displayed Kaol's sensor readings from the outer veil. She laid out her theory that an unknown species, possibly the Terrans described in the ancient files, was operating in the galaxy's frontier, intervening to protect Concord citizens, and approaching from beyond the veil. When she finished, there was silence. Then the Dralith delegation laughed. It was not subtle laughter. The Dralith were large, heavily built reptilians with thick scales and deep voices, and when they laughed, the sound filled the chamber like rolling thunder. Their delegation leader, a decorated military commander named Valith, stood and addressed the assembly with open contempt. A child plays with old files and thinks she has found a ghost, Valith said. The Terrans are a bedtime story, and these frontier reports prove nothing except that the outer reach is a strange place full of strange people who see things that are not there. I move that this matter be dismissed. The assembly voted. The motion to dismiss passed easily. The Dralith and their allies held a comfortable majority, and no one was willing to risk political capital on the theories of a junior archivist with no standing and no allies. Setha walked out of the chamber with her head held high and her eyes burning the deep violet of Velari humiliation. She had expected this. Donovan had warned her, but expecting something and experiencing it were very different things. She went back to the library. She went back to her archives. She went back to work. But she did not stop, and far away in a secure military compound on the Dralith homeworld, someone else was not laughing. Warlord Kathos was the highest-ranking military officer in the Dralith hegemony, and one of the most powerful individuals in the Conquered. He was old for a Dralith, nearly 200 years, and he had survived that long not by being the strongest or the most aggressive, but by being the most careful. He trusted data more than instinct, evidence more than tradition, Inar and his own analysis more than anyone else's opinion. He had watched Setha's presentation via secure feed, and while the rest of the assembly had laughed, Kathos had not. The data cache evidence was interesting but inconclusive. The frontier reports were troubling but could have multiple explanations. Ruhl's testimony was compelling, but anecdotal. None of it by itself was enough to act on. But the sensor readings from the outer veil were something else entirely. Kathos had spent his career studying military threats. He had commanded fleets, planned invasions, and analyzed more tactical data than any living Drelith. And when he looked at those gravitational readings, the regular spacing, the coordinated movement, the steadily increasing intensity, he did not see stellar drift or natural phenomena. He saw a fleet so large that it warped the fabric of space around it, a fleet moving with a precision that spoke of a civilization far more advanced than anything the Concorde had ever encountered, and it was heading toward them. Kathos did not take this to the assembly. He did not file a report. He did not consult with his peers or his superiors. Instead, he did what he had always done when faced with an unknown threat. He sent someone to look. He assembled a covert strike fleet, 12 of the Drelith hegemony's most advanced warships, crewed by elite soldiers, equipped with the best sensors and weapons the Concorde could build. Their mission was simple: travel to the outer veil, find the source of the anomalies, assess the threat, and report back. And if the threat proved real, they were authorized to destroy it. The fleet departed in secret, slipping out of Drelith space under false transponder codes and making the long journey to the galaxy's edge. It took them 3 weeks. 3 weeks of faster-than-light travel through increasingly empty space, watching the stars thin out and the void grow deeper and darker. They reached the edge of the outer veil on a day that the fleet commander, Admiral Sarath, would remember for the rest of her life. The veil stretched before them like a wall of nothing, a vast expanse of empty space, hundreds of light years across, containing no stars, no planets, no dust, no gas, no anything. It was the largest void in the known galaxy, and it had always been assumed to be natural. Sarath ordered her fleet to full stop and activated every sensor they had. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty dark. Then the sensors started reporting. The readings came in waves, each one stronger than the last. Gravitational signatures, energy signatures, mass signatures, all of them enormous, all of them coming from the other side of the veil. And then the veil itself seemed to shift, not physically. It was still empty space, but the sensors showed something moving through it, coming toward them. Not one thing, not 10 things, not 100, thousands of objects, each one registering a mass greater than anything in the Concorde's fleet. They moved in perfect formation, spread across a front that was wider than most star systems. They moved with a speed and precision that the Drelith's most advanced tactical computers could not track. Admiral Sarath stood on her bridge and stared at her tactical display and felt something she had never felt before in her entire military career. Fear. Real, deep, bone-level fear. She opened a secure channel to Warlord Kathos. Her voice when she spoke was steady, but only barely. "Warlord," she said, "there are thousands of them." The channel was silent for a long moment. Then Kathos replied, and for the first time in living memory, his voice was not calm. "Do not engage. Observe only. And Admiral, do not let them see you." But it was already too late for that, because the fleet on the other side of the veil had known the Drelith were coming long before they arrived. It had known because it had been watching the galaxy for a very, very long time. And now at last it was time to stop watching. Admiral Sarath was a career soldier. She had commanded warships since she was old enough to hold a rank, and she had fought in 3 border conflicts, 2 pirate suppression campaigns, and the brief but brutal Korvathi trade war of a century ago. She had been shot, burned, blown across a bridge by an exploding console, and once floated in the vacuum of space for 11 minutes after a hull breach before being rescued. She was not a woman who panicked, but standing on the bridge of the Drelith heavy cruiser Ironscale, watching her tactical display fill with signatures that should not exist, she felt the cold hand of something very close to panic wrap itself around her chest. The objects on the other side of the veil were moving, not toward the veil, through it, and they were crossing the empty space with a casual speed that her navigation officers could not calculate properly because their instruments were not designed to measure anything that fast. And as the first of them came close enough for detailed scans, the data that came back made no sense. The lead object was a ship. That much was clear from its energy signature and its controlled movement. but it was enormous, over 20 kilometers long, with a mass that made the Iron Scale's computers throw error codes. It was larger than any space station the Concorde had ever built. It was larger than some moons, and it was just one of thousands. "Admiral," her sensor officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am reading weapon systems on the lead vessel. Energy output is..." "Admiral, I cannot give you a meaningful number. My instruments are not calibrated for readings this high." Sareth stared at the display. Her 12 ships, the finest the Dralith hegemony had to offer, the pride of the most powerful military in the Concorde, suddenly looked very, very small. "Hold position," she ordered. "Do not power weapons. Do not activate targeting systems. Do not do anything that could be interpreted as hostile." She had received Kathos's order to observe only, and she intended to follow it. But something told her that it would not matter what she did. Whatever was on the other side of those ships already knew she was here. She could feel it the way a small animal feels the gaze of a predator. Not through any sense she could name, but through something deeper and older. For 2 hours, the fleet held position. The unknown vessels continued to emerge from the veil, spreading out in a formation that was both beautiful and terrifying in its precision. Sareth counted them until the numbers became meaningless. 500, 1,000, 2,000, still more. And then one of the unknown ships broke formation. It was not the largest vessel. It was medium-sized by the standards of the fleet around it, perhaps 5 kilometers long, which still made it many times the size of the Iron Scale. It moved away from the main formation and headed directly toward the Dralith fleet with an unhurried grace that reminded Sareth, absurdly, of someone walking across a room to greet a guest. Her weapons officer looked at her with wide eyes. "Admiral." "Hold," Sareth said. "Sir, hold." The unknown vessel stopped at a distance of approximately 1,000 kilometers, close enough to be clearly visible on their sensors, far enough that it was not an immediate physical threat. It hung in space, motionless, radiating a calm energy signature that contrasted sharply with the barely controlled terror on the Iron Scale's bridge. Nothing happened for several minutes. Then Sareth's communication console activated, an incoming signal, broadcasting on Concorde standard frequencies in fluent galactic common. The voice was calm, measured, and unlike anything she had heard before. It had a warmth to it, a depth, as if the speaker was someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment and wanted to get it right. "Dralith Fleet, this is the Terran stewardship vessel, Quiet Hand. When we have been aware of your presence since you entered this sector, we mean you no harm. We request that you hold your position and maintain peaceful posture. We are not your enemy." Sareth's blood went cold. Not because of the words were reasonable, even friendly, but because of one word in particular, Terran. She had heard the myths. Every species in the Concorde had. The ghost stories about a death world species that had once walked among the stars and then vanished into legend. She had always dismissed them the way every practical, rational military officer dismissed fairy tales. But fairy tales did not send fleets of thousands through the outer veil. Fairy tales did not build ships that dwarfed moons. Fairy tales did not speak fluent galactic common on Concorde frequencies. She opened a return channel. "Terran vessel, Maj, this is Admiral Sareth of the Dralith hegemony, commanding the Concorde reconnaissance fleet. We acknowledge your transmission. We will hold position." She paused, then added, "What do you want?" There was a brief silence. When the voice returned, there was something in it that Sareth could not quite identify. It might have been sadness. It might have been relief. "We want to talk," the voice said. "We have been silent for a very long time, and there are things the galaxy needs to hear, but not like this, not from a distance. We request a face-to-face meeting. Admiral, we would like to come aboard your vessel. 2 of us, unarmed. You may take any security precautions you wish." Sareth looked at her bridge crew. They looked back at her with expressions that ranged from shock to terror. And the idea of inviting representatives of an unknown and overwhelmingly powerful species onto their ship was, by any military standard, insane. She opened the channel again. "Agreed. Docking Bay 3, 1 hour." She closed the channel and turned to her first officer. "If this goes wrong," she said, "it was nice serving with you." Her first officer, a young Dralith named Torek who had never been in actual combat, managed a shaky grin. "If this goes wrong, Admiral, I doubt we will have time to notice." 1 hour later, a small craft detached from the quiet hand and crossed the distance between the two fleets. It was sleek and simple, with no visible weapons. It entered the Ironscale's docking bay with a precision that the Draelith deck crew found almost insulting. The craft settled onto the bay floor without so much as a vibration, as gently as a leaf landing on still water. The bay was ringed with armed Draelith soldiers. Sarath had placed every available combat unit between the docking bay and the rest of the ship. It was a pointless gesture, and she knew it, but protocol was protocol. The craft's door opened. 2 figures stepped out. They were smaller than Sarath had expected. The Draelith were large by galactic standards, tall, broad, heavy with muscle and armored scale. These beings were none of those things. They stood perhaps a head shorter than the average Draelith. Their skin was smooth and unarmored, ranging in shade from a warm brown to a pale tan. They had flat faces with forward-facing eyes, small noses, and mouths that curved naturally upward at the corners, giving them an expression that looked, to Draelith eyes, permanently amused. They wore simple clothing, dark, close-fitting garments with no visible rank insignia, no weapons, no armor. They looked by every metric the Draelith used to evaluate a species' threat level, completely harmless. But Sarath had read enough reports and heard enough myths to know that appearances meant nothing with these beings. She studied them carefully as they stepped onto the deck and looked around with expressions of open curiosity. One of them, the taller one, with dark skin and close-cropped gray hair, smiled when she saw the ring of armed soldiers. "Admiral Sarath," she said in flawless galactic common. Her voice was the same one from the communication channel. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. My name is Commander Yara Osi. This is my colleague, Dr. Thomas Reyes. We are representatives of the Terran stewardship." Sarath stepped forward. She towered over both of them. Up close, she could see details she had missed before. The way their eyes moved constantly, taking in everything, assessing, analyzing. The way they stood balanced and ready despite their relaxed posture. The way the one called Reyes kept his hands visible at all times, a gesture of openness that was also, Sarath noticed, a combat stance. These were not soft creatures. They were creatures that had learned, over thousands of generations on a world that wanted them dead, to look soft. It was camouflage, the most dangerous kind. "Commander Osei," Sarath said, "you said you wanted to talk." "Talk." Osei nodded. She did not seem offended by the bluntness. If anything, she seemed to appreciate it. "How much do you know about us?" she asked. "Ani myths," Sarath said. "Ghost stories. A death world species that vanished from the galaxy 50,000 years ago. Until 10 minutes ago, I did not believe you existed." "Fair enough," Osei said. "Then let me give you the short version." She looked around the docking bay, at the soldiers, at the ships beyond the bay doors, at the stars visible through the viewports. "Your ancestors kicked us out, not just the Draelith, all of them. The species that ran the galaxy 50,000 years ago decided that a bunch of Deathworld primates from an outer arm rock were not worth the trouble. They froze us out of trade, denied us territory, and when we tried to establish our own colonies, they burned them." She said this without anger. She said it the way someone might describe weather that had happened a long time ago in a place they no longer lived. "We had a choice," she continued. "Fight, and we could have fought even then. Or leave. We chose to leave. We crossed the outer veil into the unexplored half of the galaxy, and we built something new." Reyes spoke for the first time. His voice was quieter than Osei's, with a gentle accent that Sarath could not place. "What we built was not an empire. We had seen what empires do. The species that pushed us out were empires. They dominated, they competed, they hoarded. We decided to try something different. We called it the stewardship. The idea was simple," Osei said. "We would grow, we would learn, we would build, but we would not conquer. We would not dominate. And when we were strong enough, we would come back, not to take revenge, not to claim what was denied to us, but to watch over the galaxy that had rejected us, to protect it, quietly, without being seen." Sarath felt a chill run through her scales. "The navigation corrections, the rescues, the pirates," Osei smiled. "You noticed." "Thousands of years," Sarath said. "You have been doing this for thousands of years. Longer than the Concord has existed," Osei confirmed. We redirected asteroids that would have hit populated worlds. We stabilized stars that were on the edge of going supernova. We intervened in plagues and famines, in natural disasters. Always quietly, always invisibly. We watched civilizations rise and fall and rise again. We protected you, all of you, not because you asked, not because you deserved it, but because that is what we chose to be. The docking bay was silent. Even the armed soldiers had lowered their weapons slightly, caught up in the weight of what they were hearing. Sarat's mind was racing. She was a military officer. She thought in terms of threats and resources and strategic advantage. And what Osei was describing was the single most powerful strategic advantage in the history of the galaxy. A civilization with the technology to move stars and the discipline to hide for 50,000 years. Why now, she asked. Why reveal yourselves now? Osei and Reyes exchanged a look. It was a brief glance, but Sarath caught something in it that made her stomach drop. Fear. Not the kind of fear that came from facing an enemy you were not sure you could beat. The kind of fear that came from knowing exactly what was coming and knowing it was terrible. Because something is coming, Osei said. Something we cannot stop alone. And if we do not stop it, there will be nothing left to protect. She reached into her jacket and produced a small device, a data projector. She activated it, and a holographic image appeared in the air between them. It showed the galaxy, the full spiral, both halves, mapped in detail that no Concord chart had ever achieved. On the far side, beyond the territory humanity had claimed, there was a region marked in red. It was large. It was spreading. We call it the swarm, Osei said. It is not from our galaxy. It came from the void between galaxies. From the dark space where nothing should live. It is a collective intelligence. 80 billions of organisms linked together into a single mind. It consumes. That is all it does. It arrives at a star system, it strips it of all matter and energy, and it moves on. It grows with everything it takes. She zoomed the display in. The red region was not static. It was expanding, tendrils reaching outward like the roots of a terrible tree. We first encountered it 400 years ago, Reyes said. It had entered the far edge of our territory. We fought it. We lost entire worlds before we learned how to slow it down. And we have been fighting it ever since. A holding action, a war of attrition, buying time. But it learns. It adapts. Every weapon we use against it, it develops a counter for. Every strategy we employ, it finds a way around. It is coming this way, Osei said, toward the Milky Way's core, toward you. And we have slowed it, but we cannot stop it. Not alone. She deactivated the projector and looked at Sarath with those strange, forward-facing eyes. That is why we are here, Admiral. Not because we wanted to reveal ourselves. Not because we wanted to play politics or impress anyone. We are here because the galaxy is in danger, and we need help. We need all of you. Every species, every ship, every resource the Concord can bring to bear. And we need it soon. Sarath stood very still for a long time. Then she said, I need to contact my warlord. Of course, Osei said. Take all the time you need. But Admiral, do not take too long. Sarath returned to her bridge and opened a secure channel to Warlord Kathos. She reported everything. The size of the Terran fleet, the meeting, the warning. She transmitted the sensor data, or the holographic recording, all of it. Kathos listened in silence. When she finished, the channel was quiet for so long that she thought the connection had been lost. Then Kathos said, Bring them to Thessera Prime. Warlord, the Assembly will... I know what the Assembly will do. Bring them anyway. It is time the galaxy stopped telling ghost stories and started facing reality. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavier than Sarath had ever heard it. And Admiral, what is your assessment of these Terrans? Sarath looked out her viewport at the Terran fleet. Thousands of ships stretching across a formation so vast that her sensors could not find its edges. Ships built by a species that had been rejected by the galaxy and had responded by quietly protecting it for 50,000 years. My assessment, Warlord, is that they are everything the myths said they were, and I am very, very glad they are on our side. On the far side of the veil, in the territory humanity had claimed and cultivated for millennia, The stars were going dark, not dying, being consumed. System by system, the swarm advanced, and behind it there was nothing. No light, no matter, no energy, no life. Just the void, expanding, hungry, and patient. Humanity had held the line for 4 centuries. They had built weapons that could crack planets, shields that could withstand the energy output of a star, ships that could cross the galaxy in days. And still the swarm came. Still it adapted. Still it grew. Commander Ose stood in the docking bay of the Iron Scale and looked at the armed Dralith soldiers around her and the stars beyond the viewport and thought about Earth. She had never been there. No living human had. Earth was a memory now, a story passed down through generations. A small blue world orbiting a yellow star where a species of clever primates had looked up at the night sky and decided that they wanted to see what was out there. They had found a galaxy that did not want them, and they had responded not with hatred, not with vengeance, but with the most human thing imaginable. They had decided to help anyway, because that was what humans did. They fell down and they got back up. They were beaten and they refused to stay beaten. They were rejected and they refused to become bitter. They were born on a world that tried to kill them every day of their existence, and they responded by becoming the most stubbornly, irrationally, magnificently persistent species the galaxy had ever produced. And now the galaxy needed them, not as myths, not as ghost stories, not as legends whispered in the dark, as allies. Osi looked at the Dralith soldiers around her, these tall, armored, powerful beings who had once been part of a civilization that had cast humanity out, and she felt no anger, only a weary kind of hope. She hoped it would be enough. Across the galaxy, on Thesara Prime, Setha sat in her apartment and stared at the latest sensor data from the outer veil. The anomalies were no longer anomalies. They were clear, unmistakable readings of a fleet in transit, a fleet so large it defied comprehension. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, with something else, something she could not quite name. The Terrans were real. They were coming, and everything was about to change. She opened her personal log and typed a single entry. The myths are coming home. Then she closed the log and went to the window and looked up at the night sky above the Sara Prime. Somewhere out there, beyond the veil, beyond the darkness, beyond 50,000 years of silence, a species that had been told it did not belong was returning to a galaxy that needed it. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if the galaxy was ready. She did not know if anyone was ready. But for the first time since she had found that ancient data cache in the deep archives, she was not afraid. She was ready. The Terran fleet arrived at the Sara Prime on a day that the galaxy would never forget. It did not come in secret. It did not sneak through back channels or slip past border patrols. It came openly, broadcasting its presence on every frequency, announcing itself to every sensor array, every monitoring station, every ship and colony and outpost in the Concord's vast network. It came because it wanted to be seen. After 50,000 years of silence, the Terrans were done hiding. Setha was standing on the observation deck of the Great Library when the first ships appeared in the sky above Thesara Prime. She had received word 3 days ago, a private message from Admiral Sarath, forwarded through channels that Setha did not want to think too hard about, telling her that the Terrans were real, they were coming, and she should prepare the assembly. She had tried. She had gone back to Dorovan, who had gone pale when he read Sarath's message, and then spent an hour sitting in silence before finally picking up his communication device and calling every contact he had in the Concord's political structure. He had been dismissed politely and not so politely by most of them. The Dralith delegation had threatened him. The Korvati had laughed. The Thesari had expressed concern and done nothing. Only a handful of minor species representatives had listened, and a few journalists who smelled a story and did not care whether it was true as long as it was interesting. So when the fleet appeared, most of the galaxy was not prepared. The ships came through in waves. First the scouts, fast, sleek vessels that were small by Terran standards, but still larger than most Concord warships. When they fanned out around the Sara Prime in a defensive perimeter, not threatening but clearly establishing a presence. Their transponders broadcast a simple identifier: Terran stewardship, diplomatic mission. Then came the main fleet, Cruisers, carriers, support ships, hundreds of them, moving in the precise formation that had become the Terran signature. They were beautiful in a way that Scytha had not expected. Concorde warships were angular and aggressive, designed to intimidate. Terran ships were curved and flowing, their hulls smooth and organic-looking, as if they had been grown rather than built. They radiated a quiet power that was somehow more intimidating than any weapon bristling from a Drelith battleship. And then behind them all came the Everest. The HSS Everest was the Terran stewardship's flagship, and it was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. It was not just a ship, it was a world. 60 kilometers from bow to stern, with a beam of nearly 15 kilometers, it hung in space above the Sara Prime like a second moon. Its hull was covered in what appeared to be growing vegetation. Actual plants, green and alive, clinging to the exterior, as if the ship itself was a garden floating in the void. Through transparent sections of the hull, Scytha could see forests, lakes, open sky. The Everest had its own biosphere, its own weather, its own ecosystem. It was a declaration, not of war, but of intent. We are alive. We grow things. We carry life with us wherever we go. The people of the Sara Prime stood in their streets and on their rooftops and stared upward with expressions that ranged from awe to terror. Our communication networks overloaded as billions of messages were sent simultaneously. News feeds across the Concorde interrupted their regular programming. Within an hour, every sentient being in the known galaxy knew that the myths were real. The Concorde Assembly was called into emergency session. The Great Dome Chamber was in chaos when Scytha arrived. Representatives from all 12 species were shouting over each other, demanding explanations, making accusations, calling for military responses. The Drelith delegation was the loudest, as always. Their leader, Valeth, the same commander who had publicly laughed at Scytha months ago, was on his feet, his scales flushed dark with rage, demanding that the shield wardens intercept the Terran fleet and turn it away by force. Nobody pointed out the obvious absurdity of this demand. The Concorde's entire military combined could not have challenged the Terran fleet any more than a single fish could challenge an ocean. Warlord Kathos was not present in the chamber. He was watching from a secure location, communicating only with his most trusted officers. He had been preparing for this moment since Sarah's report, and he knew exactly how the assembly would react. He also knew that it did not matter. The Terrans were here. The galaxy could accept that fact or deny it, but it could not change it. The shouting continued for nearly an hour before a new signal cut through the noise. Every screen in the chamber, every holographic display, every communication device simultaneously received an incoming transmission. It was the Terrans broadcasting on all frequencies. The image that appeared was of a woman. She stood on what appeared to be a bridge, the bridge of the Everest, though most of the assembly did not know that yet. She was of medium height, with dark brown skin, short-cropped white hair, and eyes that were sharp and steady. She wore a simple dark uniform with no visible decoration except a small emblem on her chest, a circle containing the silhouette of a planet, Earth. She looked into the camera with the calm confidence of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for this moment, which in a sense she had. "My name is Admiral Lena Okafor," she said. "I am the commanding officer of the Terran Stewardship Combined Fleet. I am addressing the Concorde Assembly and all species of the known galaxy." The chamber fell silent. Every eye turned to the screens. "I know this is a shock," Okafor continued. "I know you have questions. And I know many of you are frightened. And I know some of you are angry. You have the right to be all of those things. We have been silent for a very long time, and we owe you an explanation." She paused. When she spoke again, her voice was measured and direct. 50,000 years ago, my ancestors came to this galaxy as explorers. They found civilizations that were older and more powerful than they were, and those civilizations decided that humanity was not welcome. We were denied trade, denied territory, denied a place at the table. When we tried to build on our own, we were destroyed, so we left. We crossed the outer veil, and we built a new civilization in the galaxy's far half, a civilization founded on a single principle, that strength should be used to protect, not to dominate. For 50,000 years, we have lived by that principle. We watched over this galaxy from the shadows. We intervened when we could, redirecting asteroids, stabilizing stars, aiding ships in distress, neutralizing threats that you never knew existed. We did this not for gratitude, not for recognition, and not for power. We did it because it was right. She let that sink in. Around the assembly chamber, the silence was absolute. But I did not come here to give you a history lesson, Okafor said, and her voice hardened. I came here because the galaxy is in danger, and history will not save us. The image behind her shifted. A holographic map of the galaxy appeared. Both halves, the known and the unknown, displayed in more detail than any Concord chart had ever achieved. On the far side, beyond Terran territory, a region of deep red was spreading inward like a bloodstain. 400 years ago, we made contact with an extragalactic entity. We call it the Devourer Swarm. It is a collective intelligence, billions of biomechanical organisms linked into a single mind. It does not negotiate. It does not communicate. It consumes. It enters a star system, strips it of all matter and energy, incorporates what it takes into itself, and moves on. It grows with everything it eats. The map zoomed in. The red region pulsed. We have been fighting it for 4 centuries. We have thrown everything we have at it. Weapons, technology, strategies that took us decades to develop. We have slowed it. We have not stopped it. It learns, it adapts. Every weapon we use, it develops resistance to. Every tactic we employ, it finds a counter for. It is the most dangerous thing we have ever encountered, and it is heading this way. She pointed at the map. The red tendrils were reaching toward the outer veil, toward the known galaxy, toward every world and every species the Concord called home. At its current rate of advance, it will reach the outer veil within 2 years. It will reach the Concord's outer territories within 3. And if it is not stopped, it will consume everything, every world, every species, every star, everything. The chamber erupted. Voices screamed over each other. Denials, demands for proof, accusations of deception. Valeth was on his feet again, his voice booming. This is a trick, a fabrication designed to make us submit to Terran authority. They appear from nowhere with an impossible fleet and an impossible story and expect us to believe them? I know this is a conquest disguised as a warning. Several delegations shouted their agreement. The chamber descended into bedlam. Okafor watched the chaos with an expression of weary patience. She had expected this. She had planned for it. She waited until the shouting reached its peak and then spoke again. And somehow her voice, calm, clear, and cutting, sliced through the noise like a blade. I understand your doubt. In your position, I would doubt too. So let me offer you proof. She nodded to someone off-screen. A moment later, the holographic display changed. Raw data began streaming across every screen in the chamber. Sensor readings, combat footage, scientific analyses, damage reports, hundreds of files, thousands of data points, all meticulously documented, and all carrying Terran authentication codes that the Concord systems could verify independently. The combat footage was the most disturbing. It showed Terran ships engaging the swarm in a system that no one in the chamber had ever seen. The swarm organisms were nightmarish, vast, shapeless masses of dark biomechanical matter that moved with a fluid, predatory intelligence. They swarmed over Terran ships like living shadows, dissolving hulls, absorbing energy, growing larger with every bite. The Terran ships fought with weapons that made the Concord's best armaments look like toys, beams of energy that could crack planets, projectiles that moved at relativistic speeds, shields that burned with the light of captured stars. And still the swarm came. Still it adapted. Still it grew. In one piece of footage, in a Terran cruiser, a ship larger than anything the Concorde had ever built, was overwhelmed. The swarm organisms covered it completely, dissolving it from the outside in. The ship's final transmission was a single word, broadcast on all frequencies. Remember. The chamber was quiet now. Even Valeth had sat down. Setha watched from her seat in the observer's gallery. She had seen some of this data already. Fragments, hints, pieces of the puzzle she had been assembling for months. But seeing it all together, seeing the scale of what humanity had been fighting, she felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. And then she did something she had not planned to do. She stood up. The observer's gallery was not supposed to participate in assembly proceedings. Archivists were meant to watch and record, not to speak. But Sayetha had been watching and recording for months while the assembly ignored every warning she had tried to give them, and she was done being silent. "The Admiral is telling the truth," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in the stunned quiet of the chamber, it carried to every corner. Hundreds of heads turned toward her. She felt the weight of all those eyes: Drelith, Korvathi, Thesari, Valari, and a dozen other species, and she did not flinch. 6 months ago, I found data caches in the deep archives of the Great Library, files that were over 40,000 years old. They described the Terrans, their biology, their history, their first contact with the galaxy, and their disappearance. I brought this evidence to the assembly. I was laughed at. I was dismissed. Or Commander Valeth himself called me a child playing with old files. She looked directly at Valeth. The Drelith commander's scales had gone a mottled shade that meant either anger or embarrassment, possibly both. The data caches also contained warnings, Setha continued, not just about the Terrans, but about what they were preparing for. The ancient species that wrote those files knew something was coming. They knew the Terrans were the galaxy's best chance of surviving it. And they erased the Terrans from history anyway, because they were too proud and too afraid to admit that a Death World species might be more important than they were. She looked around the chamber. The Conquered has spent 50,000 years telling itself that it is the pinnacle of galactic civilization, that there is nothing out there it cannot handle, and that its military is strong enough, its technology advanced enough, its species wise enough to face any threat. And for 50,000 years, that has been a lie. The only reason this galaxy has survived is because a species you tried to erase has been protecting you from the shadows. The silence in the chamber was total. Setha's eyes had shifted to the deep, burning gold of Valari conviction, a color that meant she would not be moved. "Admiral Okafor is asking for your help, not demanding it. Asking. After everything this galaxy did to her people, she is standing in front of you and asking for an alliance. I think the least you can do is listen." She sat down. Her hands were trembling, but her voice had not shaken once. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The weight of what Sayetha had said hung in the air like smoke. Then a new voice cut through the silence. It came not from the chamber floor, but from a secure communication channel that was suddenly broadcast to every speaker in the room. "The archivist is right. It was Warlord Kathos." His image appeared on the chamber's central display. A massive Drelith, old and scarred. His scales the dark gray of advanced age. His eyes were the color of old iron. He was not in the chamber, but his presence filled it anyway. "I sent a covert fleet to the Outer Veil 3 months ago," Kathos said. His voice was flat and hard. 12 ships, our best. They encountered the Terran fleet. They were outmatched in every conceivable way. The Terrans could have destroyed them with a thought. Instead, they talked. They explained. They showed us what was coming." He paused. When he continued, there was something in his voice that the assembly had never heard from a Drelith warlord before. Humility. "I have spent 200 years defending the Concord. I have fought every enemy this galaxy has produced. And I am telling you now, without pride and without shame, that the Devourer swarm is beyond anything we can face alone. The Terrans have been fighting it for 400 years with technology that makes ours look primitive, and they are losing. If they cannot stop it alone, we certainly cannot." Valeth rose to his feet. "You sent a fleet without authorization. You concealed intelligence from the assembly. You have betrayed—" "I have done what needed to be done," Kathos said, cutting him off, "as I always have. And what needs to be done now is to stop arguing about politics and start preparing for war. Real war. Not the border skirmishes and trade disputes that pass for conflict in this comfortable, complacent Concord. War for survival." His eyes swept the chamber through the display screen. "The Terrans are not our enemy. They never were. The swarm is our enemy. And if we do not unite, all of us, every species, every ship, every weapon we have, then there will be nothing left to argue about." The chamber began to stir. Voices rose, some in anger, some in fear, some in something that might have been the beginning of agreement. The Korvathi delegation was conferring urgently among themselves. The Thesari were already calculating logistics. The smaller species, the ones who had always been overlooked in the Concord's power games, were watching with a mixture of terror and strange hope. If the old order was breaking, maybe what came next would give them a voice they had never had. Valeth was still standing, his jaw clenched, his scales dark with fury, but he was alone. The other members of the Drelith delegation had not risen to support him. They were looking at the combat footage still playing on the screens, Terran ships being devoured by the swarm, and they were doing the math that every military mind in the chamber was doing. If the Terrans, with all their power, could not win alone, then the Concord's choice was simple: unite or die. Valeth sat down. He did not speak again. On the Everest Bridge, Admiral Okafor watched the Assembly's deliberations through the live feed. Her executive officer, Captain James Adeyemi, stood beside her with his arms crossed. "They are coming around," Adeyemi said. "Some of them," Okafor replied. "Not all. Well, not yet, but enough." She turned away from the screen and looked out the bridge's main viewport at the Sarah Prime below. A beautiful world. Green continents, blue oceans, white clouds. It reminded her of the pictures of Earth that hung in every Terran school and home and government building. A reminder of where they came from and what they were fighting to protect. "Get me Commander Osei," she said, "and Dr. Reyes. I want a full technical briefing prepared for the Concord's military leadership. Ship specifications, weapon systems, shield frequencies, tactical doctrines, everything. If they are going to fight beside us, they need to know what they are fighting." "And what about the trap?" Adeyemi asked quietly. Okafor was silent for a moment. The trap. The plan that humanity had been building in secret for over a century. On a network of dead stars, stellar remnants that had been carefully selected, repositioned, and rigged with energy collectors that could harness and focus the residual power of a collapsed star. A weapon of last resort, designed to deliver a single, devastating blow to the swarm's core intelligence. The problem was the bait. The trap would only work if the swarm's core, the central node that coordinated its billions of organisms, could be lured into the kill zone. And the only bait that would work was a fleet large enough and aggressive enough to make the swarm commit its full force. A fleet that would have to hold the line against the full might of the Devourer swarm while the trap was being armed. A fleet that would take catastrophic losses. A fleet that might not survive. "The trap works," Okafor said. "The math is solid. Well, the engineering is solid, but it needs time to arm and it needs the swarm to be in position. That means someone has to hold the line." "We can hold it," Adeyemi said. "We can hold it longer with help," Okafor replied. She looked at the assembly feed again. The shouting had died down. A vote was being proposed. Not a full alliance yet, but a resolution to open formal diplomatic channels with the Terran stewardship and begin joint military planning. It was a start. And then every alarm on the Everest went off at once. The bridge erupted into controlled chaos. Officers shouted readings, displays flashed red, and the ship's AI, a calm androgynous voice that the crew called Compass, began reciting data. "Alert! Multiple deep space sensor arrays across the galactic rim have gone offline. Pattern indicates systematic destruction, moving inward from the outer edge at superluminal speed. Estimated source: Devourer Swarm Advanced Elements." Okafor's face went still. Not with surprise, she had known this was possible, but with the grim finality of a prediction coming true ahead of schedule. "Time estimate to conquered space?" she asked. "Based on current rate of advance, swarm outriders will reach conquered outer territories in approximately 8 months. Main body to follow within 18 months. 18 months. Not 3 years as they had hoped. 18 months. Okafor opened a channel to the assembly. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. The edge of a woman who had just watched her timeline get cut in half. "Members of the Concord Assembly, I regret to inform you that the situation has changed. Deep space sensors across your galactic rim are being destroyed in a pattern consistent with Devourer Swarm Advanced Forces. The swarm has accelerated. You have less than 2 years." She paused. Let the words land. "Debate is over," she said. "They are here." The assembly chamber went dead silent. And then slowly, one by one, hands began to rise. Votes. Not for a committee. Not for a study. Not for a diplomatic channel. For war. The resolution passed by a margin that no one had expected. Even the Drelith voted yes, all of them except Violith, who abstained and then quietly left the chamber and was not seen in public again. In the observers' gallery, Sitha closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 6 months. It was not relief she felt. Relief was for situations where the danger had passed. And this was something else. The grim, heavy feeling of a door closing behind you, leaving you no choice but to walk forward into whatever waited ahead. She opened her eyes and looked up at the viewport, where the Everest hung like a green jewel against the black. Somewhere out there, in the darkness between the stars, something vast and hungry was coming, and for the first time in 50,000 years, the galaxy was going to face it together. She did not know if it would be enough, but it was a start. The first 8 months after the Terrans revealed themselves were the busiest the galaxy had ever known. Every shipyard in the Concorde ran day and night. Every factory, every forge, every workshop on every world turned its output to the war effort. Species that had been rivals for centuries worked side by side, sharing technology, sharing resources, sharing knowledge that they had jealously guarded for millennia. The Terrans made this possible, not by demanding it, but by offering it. They opened their databases, they shared weapon designs, shield configurations, engine blueprints, and manufacturing techniques that advanced the Concorde's technology by thousands of years overnight. They sent engineers and scientists to every major shipyard in Concorde space, patient men and women who worked alongside alien species they had never met and treated them as equals without hesitation. It was in many ways the most human thing they could have done, not the technology, not the ships. The simple act of standing next to someone and saying, "Here, let me help." Admiral Okafor coordinated the military preparations from the Everest, which had become the de facto command center for the Joint Fleet. She worked with warlord Kathos, who had been formally stripped of his rank by the Drelith hegemony for his unauthorized fleet deployment, and then immediately reinstated when the Assembly realized he was the only Drelith commander the Terrans trusted. The relationship between Okafor and Kathos was not easy. She was calm and methodical. He was blunt and aggressive. She planned in terms of years and centuries. He thought in terms of the next battle. But they shared one thing, a complete unwillingness to waste time on politics when the survival of every living being in the galaxy was at stake. Their first meeting aboard the Everest set the tone. Kathos had arrived with a delegation of Drelith military officers, and all of them radiating the stiff-backed pride that their species was known for. The Everest corridors were wide enough to accommodate even the largest Drelith, but Kathos still had to duck through several doorways. When he reached the bridge and saw Okafor for the first time, a small human woman who barely reached his chest, he stopped and studied her for a long moment. "You are smaller than I expected," he said. "You are larger than I expected," Okafor replied, without missing a beat. "And yet here we are, both needing each other. Shall we get to work?" Kathos had stared at her for another moment. Then, for the first time in anyone's memory, the old warlord laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound that startled his own officers. "Yes," he said, "let us get to work." They worked well together. Kathos brought the Concorde's military forces into line with an iron hand and a tactical mind that even Okafor respected. He bullied, threatened, and occasionally inspired the 12 species' disparate fleets into something resembling a unified force. He was not gentle about it, but he was effective. Okafor provided the strategy. The plan was simple in concept and staggering in execution. The Terrans had spent over a century building the Threshold Array, a network of 7 dead stars, carefully selected and positioned in a chain across the approach corridor the swarm would have to use to reach the core of the galaxy. Each dead star had been fitted with energy collection and focusing systems that could harness the residual power trapped in the collapsed stellar cores. When activated simultaneously, the 7 stars would channel their combined energy into a single focused beam, a weapon that would, in theory, deliver enough power to destroy the swarm's central intelligence node. The central intelligence was the key. The swarm was not a collection of independent organisms. It was a network, and at the center of that network was a node, a vast, ancient entity that coordinated the billions of swarm organisms. Without it, the swarm would collapse into mindless fragments, still dangerous but no longer capable of the coordinated, adaptive behavior that made it unstoppable. The problem was getting the central node into the kill zone. The node was protected by the densest concentration of swarm organisms in the galaxy. It never exposed itself. It stayed deep within the swarm's territory, surrounded by billions of defenders, directing the advance from safety. To draw it out, they needed bait. They needed a threat so significant that the central node would commit everything, its full force, its personal guard, itself, to the fight. They needed to make the swarm believe that this was the decisive battle, that the galaxy's defenders were making their final stand, that victory was within reach. They needed to put a fleet in the swarm's path and hold it there. Okafor explained this to the Joint Command Staff. Terran admirals, Draelith warlords, Korvathi fleet commanders, Thesari tactical officers, and representatives from every other Concord species in a meeting aboard the Everest that lasted 14 hours. The fleet that holds the line will take heavy losses, she said, her voice flat and honest. There is no avoiding that. And the swarm will throw everything at them, and some of it will get through. Ships will be lost. People will die. The array needs approximately 4 hours to charge once the swarm enters the kill zone. 4 hours is a very long time when you are fighting the most dangerous enemy the galaxy has ever seen. She paused and looked around the room. I will not order anyone to do this. The Terran stewardship fleet will form the core of the holding force. We have the most experience fighting the swarm, and this is our plan. We will hold the line. The room was quiet. Then Kathos stood. The Draelith will stand with you, he said, not asking permission, not consulting his government, just stating a fact. One by one, the other commanders stood. The Korvathi, the Thesari, the Velari, even the Velari. A species of scholars and archivists who had never been known for their military prowess, committed every ship they had. The smaller species, the ones who had no warships and no warriors, volunteered their cargo vessels, their medical ships, their construction rigs, whatever they had. By the end of the meeting, the holding fleet numbered over 30,000 ships from every species in the Concord, anchored by the Terran stewardship's 12,000 warships. It was the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the galaxy, and every being in that room knew it might not be enough. The swarm arrived at the outer veil 6 weeks ahead of the most pessimistic projections. The deep space sensor network, what was left of it, detected the approach as a wall of gravitational distortion sweeping across the galaxy's rim. And behind that wall was darkness. The swarm had consumed everything in its path: stars, planets, dust, gas, light itself. It left behind nothing but void. The joint fleet was waiting. They had positioned themselves along the threshold, the chain of dead stars that formed the array. The formation stretched across a front of nearly 2 light years, with the Terran fleet at the center and the Concord forces on the flanks. Behind them, hidden among the dead stars themselves, were the array's activation systems. Massive energy collectors that hummed with barely contained power, waiting for the signal to fire. Admiral Okafor stood on the bridge of the Everest and watched the swarm come. It was, she had to admit, the most terrifying thing she had ever seen, and she had been fighting the swarm for 30 years. The advance forces came first. Clouds of smaller organisms, each one the size of a shuttle, swarming in patterns that shifted and flowed like living liquid. Behind them came the larger forms, creatures the size of cruisers, bristling with energy weapons grown from their own bodies, capable of dissolving starship hulls with a touch. And behind those, barely visible on the sensors but unmistakable in its gravitational signature, came the main body, the central mass. Billions upon billions of organisms packed so tightly together that they registered on sensors as a solid object. A wall of dark matter and stolen energy that stretched across the galaxy like a tidal wave. And at its heart, buried deep within the mass, the central node pulsed like a malevolent heartbeat. All fleet elements, this is Admiral Okafor. When the swarm is entering the engagement zone, all ships to combat stations. Remember your training. Remember your positions. Hold the line. She paused. The bridge was quiet. Every officer, every technician, every crew member was watching her. I know what I'm asking of you, she said, and her voice was softer now. Not weak, never weak, but honest. The voice of a woman who had carried this burden for years and was about to share it with the galaxy. I am asking you to stand in the path of the most destructive force this galaxy has ever known. I am asking you to fight and to bleed and to hold for 4 hours. Some of you will not survive. I will not pretend otherwise." She straightened. "But I have seen what every species in this fleet is capable of. I have seen Draelith warriors charge into battle against impossible odds. And I have seen Korvathi engineers build miracles out of scrap metal and stubbornness. I have seen Thessari pilots fly through hell and come out the other side. I have seen Velarri scientists solve problems that no one thought could be solved. And I have seen humans, my people, hold the line against this enemy for 400 years because we come from a world that taught us one thing above all else. You do not give up. Ever." She let the words hang in the silence. "Today we hold the line together. Today the galaxy fights as one. Not Terran, not Draelith, not Korvathi, not Thessari. One fleet, one fight, one purpose. And when this is over, when the array fires and the swarm falls, we will still be here. All of us, together." She opened her eyes and looked at the wall of darkness approaching on the tactical display. "When all ships engage." The Battle of the Threshold began at 0847 hours, Galactic Standard Time. It would last 4 hours, 11 minutes, and 37 seconds. By the time it was over, it would be the most documented, most studied, and most remembered event in the history of every species that survived it. The first wave of swarm organisms hit the fleet like a physical blow. Thousands of smaller creatures slammed into the forward shields, detonating on contact, probing for weaknesses, testing defenses. The Terran ships absorbed the impact with shields that burned white-hot. The Concord ships, equipped with Terran-upgraded shield generators, held better than anyone had expected. But the sheer volume of the attack was staggering. Within the first 30 minutes, the fleet had destroyed millions of swarm organisms. It did not matter. There were always more. The swarm did not think in terms of individual losses. It thought in terms of the whole, and the whole was vast beyond comprehension. The larger swarm creatures engaged next. They were smarter, more dangerous, capable of coordinated attacks that targeted weak points in the fleet's formation. A Korvathi cruiser took a direct hit and lost its starboard shield array. Before the breach could be exploited, a Terran frigate, the TSS Defiant, moved to cover the gap, taking fire that would have destroyed the Korvathi ship. The Defiant held for 7 minutes before its shields failed. Its crew evacuated to the Korvathi cruiser via emergency transport. The Defiant continued to fight on automated systems for another 4 minutes before it was overwhelmed. It was the first ship lost. It would not be the last. By the end of the first hour, the fleet had lost over 300 ships. Most were smaller vessels, frigates, corvettes, support ships that had gotten caught in the swarm's attacks. But several cruisers had fallen too, including 2 Draelith heavy cruisers that had charged too deep into the swarm formation and been surrounded. Kathos watched the battle from the bridge of his flagship, the Draelith dreadnought Unbreakable. He had wanted to lead from the front, but Okafor had talked him out of it. "I need you alive and thinking," she had told him. "Leave the dying to people who are worse at strategy." He had not liked it, but he had seen the logic. Now he stood at the tactical display and directed the Concord's forces with a precision that surprised even Okafor. He shifted formations, reinforced weak points. He ordered retreats when necessary and advances when possible. He was not gentle. He was a Draelith, and gentleness was not in his nature. But he was effective. Under his command, the Concord forces held their line. Hour 2 was worse. The swarm adapted, as it always did. It learned the frequencies of the fleet's shields and began producing organisms specifically designed to penetrate them. It targeted communication relays, trying to cut the fleet's coordination. It sent fast-moving strike groups around the flanks, forcing the fleet to spread its defenses thin. The Terran fleet bore the worst of it. They were at the center, directly in the swarm's main path, and they fought with a ferocity that the Concord species had never seen. Terran ships did not retreat when damaged. They patched what they could, rerouted what they could not, and kept fighting. When weapons failed, they used their ships as battering rams. When shields failed, they flew into the swarm's formations and detonated their reactors, taking thousands of organisms with them. It was not bravery exactly. It was something deeper, something that came from 60,000 years of evolution on a world that had never once promised them safety. It was the refusal to stop. the absolute bone-deep cellular-level refusal to accept defeat. The Concord forces, watching the Terrans fight, found something they had not expected: inspiration. The Draelith, who prided themselves on being the galaxy's warriors, saw a species that fought with a raw, desperate courage that put their own traditions to shame. The Korvathi, who valued practicality above all, saw engineers performing miracles under fire, rigging impossible repairs with impossible speed. The Villari, who had never considered themselves fighters, saw people who were afraid, genuinely, visibly afraid, and fought anyway. And they fought harder because of it. Hour 3. The array's charging systems were at 60%. The swarm's central node was moving closer, drawn by the intensity of the battle, committing more and more of its forces. Okafor watched the tactical display with unblinking eyes. The node was approaching the kill zone. Slowly, cautiously, but approaching. "Hold the line," she said over and over. "Hold the line." The fleet held. Ships fell. Heroes died. A Thessari pilot named Velan flew her damaged fighter into the throat of a swarm creature the size of a battleship and detonated her payload, destroying it from the inside. A Korvathi engineering team on a crippled cruiser sealed themselves in the reactor room and manually stabilized the core, keeping the ship fighting for an extra 40 minutes before the swarm broke through. A squad of Draelith Marines, their ship destroyed, drifted in space in nothing but combat suits and fought the swarm organisms with handheld weapons until a Terran rescue shuttle picked them up. And on the Everest, Admiral Okafor commanded. The Everest had taken hits, many hits. Its shields were flickering, its hull was breached in 7 locations, and its biosphere, the forests and lakes and living systems that had awed the galaxy when the ship arrived at Thessara Prime, was burning in places where the hull had failed. But the ship was still fighting, its weapons still fired, its shields still held. And Okafor still stood on its bridge, directing the battle with a calm that her crew found almost supernatural. She was not calm. Inside, she was terrified. She had been terrified since the battle began. But terror was an old companion. Humans had lived with terror since the first hominid looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. Terror did not stop them. It never had. Hour 4. The array reached 90% charge. The swarm's central node had entered the kill zone. It was fully committed now, pouring everything it had into the battle, trying to break the fleet before the trap could spring. It could sense the energy building in the dead stars. It knew something was coming, but it was too deep, too committed, too hungry to pull back. Array at 95%, Compass reported. In estimated time to full charge, 7 minutes. 7 minutes. Okafor looked at the tactical display. The fleet was battered. Over 2,000 ships lost. Thousands more damage. The swarm was pressing in from every direction, and the line was bending. Not breaking, not yet, but bending. "All ships, this is Okafor. 7 minutes. Hold for 7 more minutes. That is all I ask. 7 minutes, and this ends." 7 minutes. The Draelith dreadnought. Unbreakable moved forward, putting itself between the swarm's heaviest assault and the damaged center of the line. Kathos ordered all weapons to maximum output and all shields to forward arc. The ship blazed like a small sun, pouring fire into the swarm with everything it had. A Terran carrier, the TSS Endurance, lost its engines and began to drift into the swarm's formation. Its captain, a young woman named Torres, ordered her crew to abandon ship and then turned the Endurance's remaining weapons on the swarm organisms closing in around her. She fought alone for 3 minutes before the ship was consumed. Her last transmission was her crew roster. Every name, read aloud, so they would be remembered. A combined squadron of Korvathi, Thessari, and Villari ships, the first truly integrated multi-species unit in galactic history, held the left flank against a swarm assault that outnumbered them 50-1. They held for 5 minutes. Then 4, then 3, 2 minutes, 1 minute. "Array at full charge," Compass announced, awaiting firing command. Okafor looked at the tactical display one last time. The swarm's central node was in the center of the kill zone, surrounded by the dead stars, exactly where they needed it to be. She opened a channel to every ship in the fleet. "All ships, emergency withdrawal. Clear the kill zone, now." The fleet moved. Battered, damaged, bleeding, but moving. Ships that had been fighting for 4 hours suddenly reversed course and burned for the edges of the formation at maximum speed. The swarm pursued, sensing retreat, surging forward. The central node followed, deeper into the kill zone, drawn by the promise of victory. Okafor waited until the fleet was clear. Then she gave the order. Fire! 7 dead stars ignited. The energy released was beyond anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. 7 collapsed stellar cores, each one containing the compressed energy of a star that had burned for billions of years. It released their power simultaneously through the focusing arrays that humanity had spent a century building. The beams converged on a single point, the center of the kill zone, where the swarm's central node pulsed with stolen life. The light was visible across the galaxy. On Thessera Prime, half a galaxy away, people looked up and saw a new star appear in the sky. Brief, brilliant, and terrible. On 100 other worlds, 1,000 other worlds, beings of every species watched the flash and wondered what it meant. At the center of the threshold, the swarm's central node screamed. It was not a sound. It was a wave of psychic anguish that every telepathically sensitive species in the galaxy felt like a physical blow. The Velari on the fleet's ships staggered, their eyes flashing through every color at once. The Thesseri clutched their heads. Even the Dralith, who had no telepathic sensitivity at all, felt something, a deep primal shudder, as if the universe itself was flinching. The central node dissolved. The energy beams tore it apart at the molecular level, then the atomic level, then the subatomic level. It ceased to exist, and when it ceased to exist, the billions of swarm organisms that it had coordinated ceased to function. Across the battlefield, the swarm stopped. The great dark shapes that had been attacking with such terrible intelligence went rigid, then limp, then still. They drifted, mindless, purposeless, empty. Some collided with each other and broke apart. Some simply floated, dead husks in the void. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Okafor had ever heard. She stood on the bridge of the Everest, the battered, burning, barely functional bridge of the Everest, and watched the swarm die. Around her, her crew was crying. Some were cheering. Some were doing both at the same time. She did not cry. She did not cheer. She stood very still and breathed, and for the first time in 30 years, the weight on her shoulders was lighter. Not gone. The swarm's remnants would need to be cleaned up. The dead would need to be mourned. The galaxy would need to be rebuilt. There was so much work to do, but the line had held. The trap had worked. The enemy had fallen, and they had done it together. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief and gratitude and hard, necessary work. The remnants of the swarm, billions of mindless organisms still drifting through space, were hunted down and destroyed by joint Terran Concord task forces. It took months. It would take years to fully clear the galaxy. The losses were staggering. Over 4,000 ships destroyed, hundreds of thousands dead. Entire species had lost significant portions of their military. The Terran fleet had taken the worst of it. Nearly a third of their ships were gone, and the crews that survived bore scars that would never fully heal. But they had survived. All of them. Every species. The galaxy was wounded, but it was alive. The Concord of 12 was dissolved by unanimous vote of the Assembly. In its place, a new body was formed, the Galactic Accord, with seats for every species, including humanity. It was not a perfect institution. Nothing was. But it was built on a foundation that the old Concord had never had. Genuine equality, genuine cooperation, and the memory of what happened when every species in the galaxy stood together against the dark. Scytha was appointed as the Accord's first chief archivist, a new position created specifically to ensure that the galaxy's history was recorded accurately and completely and never again erased for political convenience. Her first act was to open the deep archives of the Great Library to every species and to begin the long process of recovering the history that had been hidden for 50,000 years. She was working in her new office, larger than her old one, with windows that looked out over the skyline of Thessera Prime, when she received a visitor she had not expected. Warlord Kathos. He looked older than he had before the battle. The gray of his scales had deepened, and he moved with a stiffness that spoke of injuries recently healed. But his eyes were the same, sharp, hard, and oddly gentle. "Chief Archivist," he said, "I wanted to see your new office." "It has windows," Scytha said. "I am not used to windows." Kathos looked out at the city below. In the sky above, the Everest was still visible, smaller now, having moved to a higher orbit, but still present, a reminder. "I owe you an apology," Kathos said. "When you first brought your findings to the assembly, I did not laugh, but I did nothing to support you either. I let you be humiliated because I was afraid of what your discovery meant. If the Terrans were real, then everything I believed about the Draelith, about our strength, our supremacy, and our place in the galaxy, was wrong." He turned to face her. "You were braver than I was. I want you to know that." Setha's eyes shifted to a warm amber, the Velari color of acceptance. "You came around when it mattered, Warlord. That is what counts." "Kathos," he said. "Just Kathos. I have been stripped of the title 3 times now. I think it is time to let it go." Setha smiled. "Kathos, then." He nodded and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "The Terran," he said. "Do you think they will stay?" "I think they will," Setha said. "They have been watching over us for 50,000 years. I do not think they intend to stop." Kathos considered this. Then he nodded again and left. That evening, Admiral Okafor came down to Thessera Prime for the first time. She walked through the streets of the capital city with a small escort, looking at the buildings, the people, the sky. She was recognized everywhere she went. People stopped and stared. Some bowed, some saluted. A few reached out to touch her hand, as if confirming that she was real. She found Scytha at the Great Library, standing on the observation deck where she had first watched the Terran fleet arrive. "Chief Archivist," Okafor said. "Admiral," Scytha replied. They stood together in silence for a while, looking out at the city and the stars beyond. "Kayathos was here earlier," Scytha said. "He asked me whether your people would stay." "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes." Okafor nodded slowly. "You were right. We are staying. Not because we need something from you. Not because we want to rule. Because this is our galaxy too. It always was. Even when we were told it was not." Setha turned to her. "Can I ask you something?" Kaithos asked it too, in a different way. "Your people had the power to take this galaxy at any point in the last 50,000 years. You had the technology, the ships, the strength. You could have come back and conquered everything. Why did you not?" Okafor was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was soft, and there was something in it that Setha could not quite identify. It might have been sadness. It might have been pride. It might have been both. "We came from a world that tried to kill us every day we were on it," she said. "Every earthquake, every storm, every predator, every disease. Our planet threw everything it had at us, and we survived. Not because we were the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. And we survived because we refused to let anything, including ourselves, stay broken." She looked up at the stars. "That is what we are. Fixers, builders, stubborn, irrational, beautiful fools who look at a broken thing and say, 'No, I can fix that.' We did not conquer the galaxy because conquering is just another way of breaking things, and we have had enough of broken things." Scytha stood beside her and felt something shift inside her. Something fundamental, something that had been waiting to click into place since the moment she had found that ancient data cache in the deep archives. "I need to update your file," she said. Okafor raised an eyebrow. "Our file?" "The original data cache I found. The one that started all of this. It classified your species under a single word. Myth." "And what will you change it to?" Setha smiled. In her eyes shifted to the brightest gold she had ever felt. The color of certainty, of truth, of something that would never need to be questioned again. "Allies," she said. Okafor smiled back. It was a small smile, tired and warm and human. "Allies," she agreed. Above them, the Everest orbited slowly through the night sky, its green hull glowing faintly with the light of the biosphere it carried. A garden in the void, a promise made of living things. And below, in the great library of Thessera Prime, a data cache that was 50,000 years old was updated for the first time in its existence. A single word was deleted. A single word was added. The myths had come home, and they were staying.